All right, welcome to the science panel for WriteHive. I'm S. Keith, and I'm here with some real life scientists. So let's go ahead and take a look at them. Lauren, do you want to start and introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, I'm Lauren Persons, and I am a test engineer on NASA's Orion capsule on the Artemis program. I have a degree in aerospace engineering and astrophysics, and I've been in the industry for just about 5 years now. And I've been writing science fiction and fantasy as a hobby for about the last 20 years.
Hi, everyone. My name's Holly Ash. I am an environmental engineer. I have been working for private companies for the last 12 years doing regulatory and compliance work for them, mainly in manufacturing, in the steel industry and in the automotive industry, and then a couple of years doing utility work for a large hydroelectric company out in California. I have 2 books published right now. I write an underwater military series called The Journey Mission. So the first 2 books in that series have been published, Crystal and Flint and Family Binds, and my 3rd book, Thicker Than Blood, will be out May 1st.
Hi everyone, I'm MK Martins. I have a PhD in molecular biology and about 8 years of experience in cell biology, glycobiology, molecular immunology, cancer research. In my free time, I'm also a writer, and I'm writing short stories and novels, mostly science fiction, but also some fantasy. And I'm also running a small blog on Instagram and on Twitter.
What are some of the top things that people tend to get wrong in your areas of expertise?
All right, I'll give this one a shot. I'm sure a lot of people are familiar with the most obvious one in space sciences, and that is sound in space. But movies have actually gotten a lot better about that recently. They've been trying to portray it a lot more accurately. You still have like the new sounds in Star Wars, but a lot of other sci-fi videos actually show that there's no sound in space. So that's the obvious one. Other things that commonly you see wrong is people exploding as soon as they go into a vacuum. You don't explode when you go into a vacuum no more than you explode when you're in water and step out of water into the air. That's something that I see wrong a lot. Besides those 2 things, faster than light travel is pretty common, even in book medium. That's one that we have no evidence to believe it is possible to go faster than light. And I guess depending on how hard your science is in the book, it's fine. You can just ignore it if you're following rule of cool. But in a lot of other more realistic sci-fis, I sometimes see that, and that's something that gets wrong a lot.
So one of the things when you see environmental disasters in movies and in books is it's usually like this one big giant event that happens all the time, like real quick, like the day after tomorrow or 2012. And that is super unrealistic. Environmental issues and disasters happen really slowly, almost to the point that most people don't realize they're happening until we just accept these things as our new normal. And a lot of it we're living right now. So that idea of the big disaster event kicking off climate change, that's not going to happen. It's the storms we're seeing now that tend to be a little bit more intense than we've always remembered, or maybe they're starting a little bit earlier, and hurricanes traveling different paths and hitting different areas that they haven't before. It's the wildfires in California and droughts. And so those are the type of things that when you're doing environmental and climate change stories, is it's a slow underlying type of disaster and not that big cinematic world ends in 24 hours kind of event.
I'm gonna mention 2 things here. Number 1 is maybe more general, how people perceive the process of science and scientists. And what is wrong here is that today in modern science, you rarely see a lone wolf scientist. So most of the science is based on groups, and yes, you have a head of a group leader, who is basically in charge of managing and leading the entire group. But this person then is rarely seen in lab or even wearing a lab coat, which is something that you see very often in movies, or you can read it in books. And another thing is that like these very small parts of everyday life, for instance, I read a couple of examples where people perceived scientists walking everywhere in their lab coats, like going for lunch, meeting visitors and things like that, which is something that you never basically do, because lab coat is just a piece of protective equipment and you don't want to carry it from the place in order to avoid carrying this contamination out of the lab. And then the second thing, which I see very often done wrong, specifically, is human cloning. So you have this very, very frequent concept that a clone of a person just wakes up, is suddenly, I don't know, like 20 or 30 years old and has no idea that it's clone, which is, at least today and not in any foreseeable future, something that is most likely not going to work this way. Because I mean, even like the most famous examples of cloning that you have, for instance, sheep Dolly, which everyone heard about, you basically grow it from an embryo from a very small animal, where you took like an egg from one sheep and the core from, or the genetical information from another animal, and then you put it in another sheep and grew a small lamb. And this sheep basically grew from a lamb into the adulthood, and that's the same how it would work with human clones.
All right, excellent. So what are like the top 3 coolest things that are in your wheelhouse that you would love to see more of?
You want to take
I guess
this
I'll
one?
go first. Switch it up this one. So since environmental stuff seems to be underlying, I would love to see a lot more addressed as far as things like invasive species and invasive plants that would be taking over natural habitats, choking out waterways and things like that. Pythons in Florida overtaking the natural species there. And these are things that we're grappling with every day. I also think it would be really cool to see a story address the decline in pollinators and how that is going to affect our food chain and global food shortages. One thing that keeps coming up in my head, to keep this a little relevant, maybe too relevant, with the COVID-19 is this is all linked back to bats. And bats are one of the biggest pollinators that we have on our planet, and this fear of bats is going to increase, and there's going to be more people attacking and killing bats. And if that species is eliminated, our food supply diminishes and it's gone. Like, would see global food shortages after that. So these small things, bees and monarchs, are all threatened species, and people get rid of them because they're afraid of them. No one wants to get stung by a bee, but they're so essential. So I think it would be really cool to see some stories take on those type of things and those small changes and the huge effect they could have for everyone.
Bats are my favorite animal. That makes me so sad.
What a fear. I love bats too, but with everything being linked back right now to some guy eating a bat, it's going to increase that fear, and people are going to try to.
All right. So cool stuff I would like to see in more space sci-fi. Up until about 15 years ago, you didn't see a lot of realistic near future sci-fis. A lot of it was space operas or distant future, space travel. But personally, I love seeing realistic near future, near term technology applied to sci-fi. So like colonization of Mars, or even interstellar travel using real technology that we have today. And so one example of that would be using generation ships. And you see some generation ships in some older sci-fi books and some more recently, but it's not a common setting. And so generation ships are the idea of we're heading for that star in another solar system, And we are going to get there based on modern technology, so non-relativistic travel, and it's going to take us hundreds of years to get there. And I think that's just such a fun setting premise, that you have this giant ship filled with thousands of people who are leaving knowing that they're going to die before they get there, and that not even their children, but maybe their grandchildren or their great-grandchildren are going to be the ones that populate the planet they eventually get to. And so that has a lot of potential for, you know, even short story snippets over the years, different, you know, things that happen on this ship. And, you know, you have to sustain that ship for, you know, all of the different environmental factors that are needed to sustain, you know, people for that amount of time, and nothing can break, or if things do break, you have to have the supplies on hand to be able to fix it. So I feel like that's a really fun, interesting setting that we don't see enough of in sci-fi, that I would love to read more books like that.
So Lauren, that kind of sounds like you might like some of my stories, because I have both near future sci-fi and a generation ship series, which I'm writing currently. So hopefully there will be more of those soon. But going back to the question, and what I'd like to see more in my field is maybe more of the conversation between the environment and our hereditary information, because like Holly said, like the changes in the environment have a tremendous effect on the species, but this is happening both on the level of the population and the individual level. And maybe like some famous examples would be, for instance, mosquitoes in temperate areas are basically tolerating lower temperatures than mosquitoes in the tropic areas, and this was done by natural selection of the individuals, which have basically higher tolerance for the cooler temperatures. But not just that, let's say there's also one example we have my cat here peeking in, but let's say Siamese cats, you know that they have this typical coloring, like they have a very bright fur, and then they have some darker spots on the fur, for instance, tips of the ears, tip of the tail, and their paws. And this is because specifically the protein which produces this color is sensitive to the temperature. So on the parts where their body is very warm, it will degrade, and that's why they will have a light fur. And then on the parts where which are cooler, like their ears and paws, this protein will be maintained. It will not degrade, and that's why you will have color. So there's a lot how you can play with this on a much larger scale, and the effect that could, for instance, global warming or the cooler temperatures have on species, both on the individual and population level. But then there's one other thing which I'd like to see done more, and that's basically a lot of the biotechnology being applied also like in space research, but also in near future sci-fi. And one of the examples that I have is, for instance, already now there are groups at the MIT working on like these exosuits that would serve a certain function, like a exointestine filled with microbiota, so a lot of good bacteria which would serve a certain purpose. And we could imagine this being used by astronauts, for instance, if they would spend a long time on some other planet. You could have good microorganisms serving some purpose, for instance, like purifying air or producing air, or maybe producing certain nutrients and things like that. And I think there's a lot of potential to use this in stories, and not just like a small cool details, but maybe creating a full story around everything that could this mean for a certain group of explorers.
I want to read that book. Can you write it right now?
I think Holly is writing that book right now, actually. And I can't wait to read it.
Yeah, that's actually a very good point. One of the reasons why I enjoy being a Holly CP is because she writes a female military sci-fi, and I really enjoy reading a military sci-fi, but there is not so much of it with female protagonists. So yeah, absolutely.
Does it combine both? Because that seems really cool.
The books that I've published are actually set in about 300 years in the future, so not quite space travel. I am working on a story right now. It doesn't include space, but is eco-terrorism. It's mimicking a little bit of what we're seeing right now, a little too closely. I kind of had to set it aside for a minute, but so yeah, there's a lot of overlap between the different disciplines and sciences in sci-fi.
But on the other hand, I do understand why there are not so many stories like that today, and this is in part because it requires a lot of research for in preparation for it. But you don't have to be a scientist to know all of these things. There are plenty of popular science articles published about the latest research which is out there, and which can serve as a very interesting starter for your whole story idea.
So that that brings us to the next question here, which is, what does the balance look like for you between when you're doing your research for your books and when you're actually doing the writing?
So maybe I'd like to go ahead and answer this question first, since I already kind of started this topic. And I write both hard sci-fi and soft sci-fi and fantasy stories, mostly short stories, but also novels. And for softer side, it can be as simple as, like I mentioned, reading a popular science article and getting an idea from it, and then building upon that idea, because it is science fiction, there's a whole fictional part of it, so you don't need to necessarily stick to science. However, when I write hard sci-fi, then I tend to stick to the facts, and then I do a lot of research, and very often this will be months, maybe sometimes even years of research. And typically I would create a folder, and I would fill this folder with all kinds of information, and I would not even start building a story idea or plotting before I have a certain facts in there from which I want to build the scientific background of this story. And this is true, for instance, for the world building, where I'm creating extraterrestrial worlds upon which I want to inhabit with alien species which would be believable. Then I take into the consideration the gravity of the planet, the size of the planet, the wavelength of the emission of the star around which the planet is orbiting, and so on. So it can be anywhere between reading a short article for 5 minutes, or having a month-long or even year-long research process, and it all depends on basically what do you want to write, because it is science fiction, but there is a whole range where you can place your story.
So for me, the research kind of comes as I need it. Usually when I'm writing a sci-fi, I'm writing from some area where I'm already familiar with all of the basics, so I don't need to do a lot of research on that. But just for my own peace of mind, there's some things that I do like to calculate. If we're accelerating a lot, then if I know there's going to be a time dilation involved, I want to figure out what that is, just because I like to know, what the time dilation is. If these people are going to be, traveling for 4 years, but they only experience 2 years of aging, then, that can be a fun element to play with in the story. Or, if I'm designing a spaceship and I want to have artificial gravity in it based on the rotation of the spaceship, I want to figure out how big I need to make that spaceship. So sometimes I'll do that calculation just to see how large it would be, because if it is spinning too quickly, then the people on board are going to notice and they're going to get sick. So, but again, this is stuff that I feel like you don't need to calculate in a lot of sci-fi unless you're going for that hard, realistic aspect of sci-fi. Otherwise, most of the time, I am just writing the story, and then as details come up that I need to figure out, I will pause and do a little bit of research on that. But I'd still say I probably do 90% writing and 10% research as far as time commitment goes.
I am probably very close to how you do it as well. I tend to focus on areas that I have a lot more experience with, whether that's environmental or manufacturing, construction type fields. And yeah, I'll look, if I know I'm going to have a big element in a story, I'll do some basic reading on it. I won't spend a lot of time, but just to get that high level understanding before I start writing the story. If any weird details come up, I'll take a few minutes to research them. But again, it's probably 90% writing to 10% research. One example I have in my first book, Crystal and Flint, when they are putting together this mega submarine where the story is going to take place, is it's a battery powered submarine. And I have worked a lot with batteries as far as cars and automotives and alternative fuel sources with hydrogen. So I had some basic understanding on how that worked. And I upscaled it to fit my needs. I mean, the technology is not currently there to pull power out of the ocean and store it in a battery to power a submarine, but I knew the basic mechanics up behind it. So I could write enough detail to make it believable, but leave enough ambiguity in there that I don't have to explain how all the particles are moving in the batteries and things like that, because that is so far beyond what I know. And it's not essential to moving the plot and the story forward, and it's not essential to the character development. And I think you got to be careful in sci-fi to find that balance of your story and plot and characters versus going too deep into the science and losing your readers.
Yeah, I definitely think that's an important balance to strike. Like you said, only go into as much detail as you need to in order to convey the topic that you're trying to, that the reader needs to understand. Because if you go into the nitty gritty details and you don't know what you're talking about, then that's a place where you can lose readers. Or even you go into the nitty gritty details that aren't needed and you've created maybe a problem or a plot hole for you later down the line.
If you're on a heavy researcher side, like I am, of course it's understood that not everything that you sort of learned in this process is going to go into your book or into your story. But also on the other hand, then you have this huge folder from which you can find details which you mentioned throughout the story, and then sometimes 10 pages of research are going to be just one, perfect sentence, finding what is most relevant to mention here in order to kind of bring this realism to your story.
Definitely. So how hard or soft do you need to make your science in your story?
I tend to write towards the softer side of sci-fi. I enjoy having the elements of science in there and the futuristic technology and what we feel like it's going to be like, and have that as for the characters to interact with. But at the end of the day, I am telling a story about people and what they're going through and their emotions, and the science is more of a background. It's the setting, may use to advance the plot a little bit, but it's not really what I'm trying to tell in my story. So that's what I like to read. So I tend to write softer sci-fi. Every once in a while, a hard sci-fi, I'll really get into something like The Martian or Jurassic Park and some of those that really get deep into the science. But even then, I skip over a lot of the science to get back to the characters.
I'd say I'm probably more on the hard sci-fi end of the spectrum when I do write sci-fi, because I write a lot of non-sci-fi too. I write a lot of fantasy that's just totally out there and not based in reality at all. But when I do write sci-fi, I do try to be, I guess, as accurate as I want to see it, because often I see space movies and stuff that I'm like, they got that wrong, and I want to see that done the right way. And so then that's what I end up enjoying writing when I go into sci-fi. So like the examples you said, The Martian, Michael Crichton, and Jurassic Park, I loved seeing those those harder sci-fis where you can tell they put a lot of time and effort into trying to get it right. Ones where you open up the sci-fi and there's a whole appendix at the end where it's like all of their sources that they use. Sometimes that makes me really happy. So I'm on the other end of the spectrum there. But as a result of that, I end up writing a lot of sci-fi short stories, because if I'm going to write it as a hard sci-fi, then it's a huge time commitment to do all of that research and to get it all that accurate. So I end up writing a lot of hard sci-fi short stories rather than hard sci-fi full novels.
So like I already said before, I write both hard and soft sci-fi. But maybe I'd like to mention one thing here, and this is something to keep in mind. Both Holly and Lauren mentioned Jurassic Park. And I think it's really important to have in mind that when you are writing hard sci-fi, this hard sci-fi could be overrun by time, because all that you can write based on is today's science, and sometimes it can happen that due to the limitations of the method, or some other limitations because of which we can't see the full truth, that today's science is only partially right or maybe even completely wrong. So as an example from the Jurassic Park, they did a lot of background research, right? And they tried to make this dinosaur very realistic. But for instance, with velociraptors, they did a big miss as opposed to what we think today, that how velociraptors looked like. However, there's one also thing in the Jurassic Park, and that's that in this cloning process, they used like frog DNA to fill in the gaps, which is, if you would do something like that, you definitely not use frog's DNA, because the closest relatives to velociraptors today are the big birds like the ostriches. So you'd tend to go to, if you would use another species to fill in the gaps, you tend to go the closest there is to the family tree. And so basically, if you would use a frog to fill in this DNA, you would not get a dinosaur cloned, So maybe that's the reason why velociraptors look nothing like velociraptors.
So when you go into writing your story and you start your drafting process or your planning process or whatever, do you already know how hard or soft you're aiming for, or does that change somewhere along the line with the editing and the drafting?
For me, I know in advance, because usually it's the setting that first snags me, or it's an idea, it's the premise. It's okay, we're going to be on Mars and there's this Mars base and this person discovers it and it's everyone in there is dead. What happened? And so I already know like the premise, how hard the sci-fi is going to be in order to unravel that story.
I'm the same way. I know the details that I need to know, and granted, I do the softer side, so I don't have to do as much research and know all of that up front. So I'm able to pants my stories a little bit more. But I do have a basic idea of here's the key elements that I want to include, whether that's, I'm going to focus on these type of weather anomalies, these type of manufacturing processes and outputs there. So I'll have some idea. There are things that come up though as I'm writing it that I didn't research, and I'll have to stop and look up again and like, oh, this would be really cool to insert this little bit of science knowledge here. So there's always going to be that stuff that comes up as you're writing the story and as you're editing it to make it work. An example, MK, because she's my critique partner. So in my books, I have these characters that they're on a different planet. They're human-like characters, but they can breathe underwater. And she really helped me develop the science of how that's going to work with their skin cells and stuff, so I could put those tiny little details in later. But she did most of the science for me because that's more in her field with the molecular biology.
Basically, I really love this detail. When I read Holly's first installment of the Journey Mission series, and it was really cool that I could breathe underwater. But then I thought, reading this, that it's really something that the other characters, which are from Earth, should have noticed, because if your skin is permeable to the air from the water, then it should feel different. There should be some sort of a different texture or something else, that characters should notice. And that's one like a cool element which really, brought two fields of Holly and mine together. When it comes to my stories, I tend to know beforehand if it's going to be soft or hard sci-fi story. And it only very, very rarely changes, and usually from the softer towards harder side, so never in reverse. So basically, if I start writing a story thinking it's going to be soft sci-fi, then sometimes, I discover like these really cool elements within which I want to expand upon, and then sometimes I can turn it into maybe a harder sci-fi story, but it only happens very rarely, and usually I know beforehand if it's going to be soft sci-fi or hard sci-fi story.
That's awesome. All right. So are there any common tropes that just really irritate you, that you see often poorly executed, or that are just completely wrong?
All the time I see the jack of all trades scientist. All the time. Your scientist is an electrical engineer, and they're a microbiologist, and they are a surgeon, and they're in neuroscience. Like, it's like the show needed someone to fit the entire body of scientific knowledge, just in case any question came up. So the scientists are always somehow miraculously experts in every single field of science. And that is one that every time I see, I just, kind of roll my eyes.
So I would say mad scientist. That's one trope that drives me crazy, turns me into a mad scientist. So basically, you often see this like one scientist which has gone all crazy, all supervillain, wants to take over the world, and does all this kind of like crazy experiments. And the thing is, in science, especially today, there are plenty of like ethical boards, rules which you need to obey. There are funding sources which require certain things like reports from you, and this all needs to happen periodically, and there are multiple like checkpoints and multiple like places where you need to kind of explain your research, and you need to you need to be able to back up why are you doing certain things. And so it's not just so easy to do something super crazy without any checks. It's almost like you imagine writing like a heist story but without any police. So it's almost the same. You would never write like a heist story without a police in it. So if you're going to write a mad scientist story, then please show how these mad scientists avoided all of the checks and got the funding and avoided all of the ethical boards and everything else. So please just try to do it like that. It's more fun with the police anyway.
So for me, a lot of what you see in the environmental side tends to be this apocalyptic story or the post-apocalyptic story. And it drives me crazy that everybody approaches this as you have some apocalyptic event and it's a reset for the globe. And none of the environmental issues we've ever had before exist, and everyone's going to go hunt and live in the woods. And that's just not what's going to happen. If humans cause a lot of problems to the environment, obviously that's why we have environmental issues, but we also fix and mitigate a lot of problems. So if there's not human intervention, invasive species are going to take over your wooded areas. You're not going to have that pristine area. It's going to be filled of underbrush that is so thick mice can't travel through it. So you're certainly not going to be going through the woods. Buildings are not going to break down immediately. 6 months ago was on a piece of property that had been abandoned for 20 years. Those buildings are still standing. The doors are a little warped, the windows might be broken out, but for the most part, they're fine. Like, you can still safely enter them. and the roads have a couple of twigs in them. They're not massive trees, have not grown up in these 15, 20 years. Another thing is there's never any electricity. And we now have so much renewable energy infrastructure in place that you will have pockets of energy even if the distribution system goes down. You have houses that have their own solar power panels. Regardless of the rest, what happens in the rest of the world, if that house is standing, it will have electricity. Windmills will continue to generate even if there's no one there. So these ideas of these widespread things, and then another one with pollution in waters. If we don't have water treatment, you can't be drinking from these streams by boiling your water. There's going to be industry along every riverbank in at least America that if those were abandoned, chemicals would leak out of that facility if left untreated and get into the water system. So this idea that the end of the world is going to be a reset and we're all going to go back to living in the woods sometimes drives me a little crazy.
I would love to see that book that you just described.
I'll put it on my list.
I would read it. All right, so give me some technobabble from your own field of expertise and then translate it into English.
So for this one, I literally went to Star Trek technobabble generator and like pulled up, terms that they use just to show how ridiculous people know it's ridiculous anyway, but when you begin to understand the words, it just sounds that much more ridiculous. So here's one that I randomly generated. The front neutron torpedo launcher has short-circuited, resulting in an explosion in the sonic resonance field generator, which basically just means the trigger for our nuclear weapon broke, so now our sound gun exploded. Which, okay. Maybe the two were connected somehow?
How would that even work?
You always get like, A happened, which caused B, and you're like, but those two things don't sound related at all, but it doesn't matter. It's technobabble, it's supposed to sound fancy, so at the end of the day, they've achieved their purpose, I guess.
Insertion of the GFP tag on the N-terminus of the protein interferes with the folding, resulting in a loss of function. Which basically just means that, putting a glowing beacon on the front end of your protein, which was supposed to do some sort of job, makes this protein completely unable to finish this job or to do it at all. And it just means, whatever you did, it completely destroyed your protein and, start from scratch.
All right, so for my technobabble, I actually pulled into some language that I have used at work, had said at work, or seen in other documents. And the world of environmental is a world of acronyms. So I could probably have an entire conversation with someone without using any actual words. So this would be something that I would have to say to someone before working on areas of certain properties. So in accordance with EPCRA regulations, I'm informing you that you're about to do work in a Superfund location that is part of a due care plan. Be aware that there could be PCBs and oils in the area due to improper disposal in accordance with RCRA regulations. So all that really means is a long time ago, someone dumped some oil on the ground, and by law, I have to tell you, you might find it. That was
a lot shorter.
Yeah, it's a lot of regulatory acts and laws that are thrown in there. So
that's awesome. So let's say somebody wants to write a harder science fiction novel, and they themselves are not a scientist, or they're branching out into a different field than they have expertise in. What would you suggest they do to make sure that that science is accurate? How could they best do that?
I would first ask if they're doing like hard sci-fi or soft sci-fi. If they're doing a hard sci-fi and they have no expertise in that field, then they're going to need to find a subject matter expert that they can consult. Because it's a lot easier to talk to someone who knows what they're talking about than it is to Google obscure things and maybe not understand what you're reading and get things wrong. But if they're on the softer end of things, then you might not need the subject matter expert. You could be able to, Google things and kind of figure your way through it. If you're just going for the general idea of things and you don't need to get into the nitty-gritty details, then, I would say go for it.
I'm going to agree. Talking to people is always the best. I ask people questions all the time. I have a text that I need to send out to my father, who was a volunteer firefighter, about doing arson in an apartment and how would that look and where should I set the fires. So it's not just for sci-fi. If you are looking for someone to kind of critique your science in something you've already written, try to find beta readers and critique partners that also write sci-fi. Not necessarily do they have to be in that field that you're looking for, but in general, if you find other people that have done research for their own books or just own interest in general knowledge, they'll be able to pick up enough to say, what, this piece doesn't make sense, or here's what I think you were trying to explain, but maybe this is a better way to do it. So if you don't have access to experts in the field that you want to write about, at least try to find beta readers that have that science in the sci-fi background in general to help pinpoint some pain areas, and then where to do additional research.
Wow, now I'm interested why Holly wanted to research how to set your apartment on fire. But yeah, coming back to the question. So yes, number one, finding a CP. So critique partner which has experience in the field is definitely the best option. The second best option is finding a beta reader with experience in the field, or at least some sort of knowledge of the topic. And this might seem very hard, but today there are plenty of like writer groups, both on NaNoWriMo and like Discord groups, and now on WriteHive there will be plenty of people with knowledge from various fields. So we will be available. You can always write to us, and I don't know how it is for other people, but personally for me, I really love my field, and reading interesting stories which have also a scientific background from my field is very interesting for me. I would like to see more of those stories. So if you have a story like this and you'd like me to read it or review it, just hit me up if I have a time, especially if it's a short story. I'd love to do it. And I'm sure plenty of other people who work in science and are also in the writing community really enjoy reading stories like that. So just become a part of some sort of community, and sooner or later you will start meeting really cool people like I met Holly and Lauren.
Fantastic points. Okay, so at what point do you feel that science actually gets in the way of fiction?
At the point where you create your own plot holes. That's tough. That's a tough one. Anytime, again, it depends on how hard or soft you're going for in the story, but if it gets in the way of the plot, of the tension, of the character development, then maybe you can, loosen things up a bit, depending on how hard or soft you're taking it.
And if you're explaining science points that are maybe mentioned once, or they're not relevant to what's actually going on, and you're going into the science of how your coffee maker works in space, or obscure details like that are really going to bog down the action of the story, I think you really need to ask yourself, what purpose is this science have in the story? How is it affecting the plot or the characters? Is it building up to something? Is it feeding into something? The same way that you need to look at when you're in any kind of book, if you're looking at, what characters are in the room and why, what purpose do they serve? What purpose does this gun somebody's holding serves, or, the cup of coffee, or whatever it is. The science has to be there for a reason. Everything in your book needs to serve a purpose to reach your ultimate goal of telling the story.
Absolutely. That made me think of when I was writing a Martian short story. And there was one detail I went to is that a Martian day is about 40 minutes longer than an Earth day. And so there's been a lot of talk about how in real life we would account for that when we have astronauts staying on Mars. You know, do you just have an almost 25-hour day? Or would you do a thing where you just kind of ignore that 40 minutes at the end of the day and that's just an extra 40 minutes of bonus sleep, you know, you get each night? And so I thought that was such an interesting detail that I like went and talked about it for like 1 or 2 paragraphs in my Mars thing. And then I was like, this is not relevant to the story in any way. I just think it's a cool detail. So I had to, you know, chop it out. But yeah, it can be really easy to get caught up in, you know, your own knowledge of the area and be like, oh, this is such a cool, interesting detail, but it doesn't have anything to do with the plot or the characters of the story. So do we really need it here? You know, and just being able to weigh objectively what needs to be in your story.
Definitely sign me up for those 40 extra minutes of sleep per day. Yeah, I mean, I basically agree with everything that was said. I maybe just have one additional point to mention, and that is that sometimes, well, not every time, but sometimes, if your science gets outdated, this can get in the way of the story. And the reason why I say only sometimes is, for instance, let's say Mary Shelley's Frankenstein was inspired by, at that time, a rather recent scientific discovery, and that is basically that if you stimulate like severed frog limbs with electricity, then those frog limbs were moving. And at the time, you know, this came to this led to the idea that basically, you know, if you would saw a lot of those like dead parts together and release an electricity, maybe you can bring an entire being to life. So today we know that this is not true, you know, so in a way this is outdated science, but it's not getting in a way of this story. But if you are basing your story on like a very important scientific element and then, you know, building completely your story upon it, then it could lose a bit of it, you know, appeal as a sort of like a hard sci-fi if in fact you're choosing a scientific fact that gets outdated.
So we touched on this a little bit, but I wanted to ask you, each of you has sort of chosen about how hard or soft you like to write. Do you tend to read mostly books that are about that same level of hardness or softness, or does that change for you?
I think for me, it depends. I do tend to gravitate more towards the softer sci-fi. I like a lot of the newer sci-fi. I'm not a big fan of the classic hard sci-fi. That is a lot of men and a lot of sex and killing stuff in space. That's not, I've tried to read a lot of those really classics and I can't make it through it. So I tend to read similar to what I write. And part of the reason why I'm writing my stories, which are female-based military sci-fi stories, is because I couldn't find them. I couldn't find the stories that I wanted to read in sci-fi because that wasn't, when I was growing up, necessarily the genre for me. So I do tend to, I'm branching out and starting to read a little bit more of the harder stuff now just to kind of get that balance. But I enjoy the softer sci-fi more. So I write softer sci-fi.
I read everything. I mean, not so much contemporary, but like speculative fiction, pretty much everything, like hard sci-fi, soft sci-fi, fantasy, urban fantasy. I mean, I do prefer to read sci-fi. I especially enjoy a very, very good hard sci-fi. But that doesn't mean that I won't read like fantasy or that I won't enjoy it. I mean, I simply enjoy a good story, just like everyone else. And then if there's like an added element of a really cool science in it, then yes, it gets me excited. But it doesn't mean that I would exclude reading a story if it doesn't have this like cool scientific element in it.
And I think I'm the same in that I generally enjoy reading harder sci-fi, and that's the kind of sci-fi that I end up writing, but I read everything all over the spectrum, and I also write everything all over the spectrum. It just kind of depends on the day of the week. But yeah, like you were saying, a lot of the older traditional sci-fis it's a lot of men, a lot of older men, a lot of the woman in the stories, or the damsel in distress, or the sexy alien, that they get a hook up with. So like you were saying, I try to write more of what I want to see in sci-fi. So I write a lot more female protagonists because historically that wasn't what you saw in sci-fi. And historically in our field, it's been dominated by men. So it's, just trying to get some more representation in there.
Absolutely.
More representation is good. So we talked a little bit about what things are portrayed wrongly or could be portrayed better. What we all know that stories are built off of conflict and things going wrong. So what sort of difficulties do you guys find in your regular job, in your regular field?
So a lot of what I do as an environmental engineer for these companies is it's my job to make sure that they're complying with all the regulatory laws that are in place. And things go wrong. So a big part of my job is emergency response and spill response. And what do we do when the chemicals get spilled and reach the water? And what do we do even if there's a human safety element involved in that and something gets released and people are exposed? So that's something that I can take really well, that experience of being an incident commander and a leader and having to make those quick decisions on what we're going to do to address these situations. And a lot of the times there's no clear answer and you just have to make a gut call. So a lot of that translates really well into storytelling, and I can really up the stakes on it a lot more. It's, in the book, it's not going to be real exciting if some oil reaches a pond and we have to shut down operations for an hour while we clean it up. But that same thought process and that same response is if, something on a construction site blew up or during an attack or a mission. So those are some elements I can take from my actual job and translate well into sci-fi.
For me, it depends on if we're talking about the field in general or my specific job, because for my specific job, nothing that dramatic is happening. I'm a test engineer, so what happens is we write and run procedures first on the mock-up spacecraft and then on the actual spacecraft. And the reason we do that is because if we run anything wrong, if we put the spaceship into a position where we'd burn out the batteries or something, we want to do that on the mock-up, not on the actual spacecraft. So just the way our job is executed in general is we do everything first on the fake to make sure that we don't screw things up on the actual spacecraft. We want to protect it as much as possible. So my day-to-day drama is not going to be on that giant scale. It's going to be like, okay, we need to run this other procedure. Do we have time to run this procedure? But probably the most drama is just getting the time to work in the lab, because every team wants to be working in the lab at once. And so the drama there is more managerial. But of course, space on a larger scale, on human space flight side of things, you have the potential for so much drama and so much action. Just look at Apollo 13. So I guess it depends on if we're talking about my day-to-day work, the stuff that happens on the ground before the spaceship launches, or if we're talking about, once we're actually up there separated from the rest of humanity. That's where most of the things tend to go wrong. And the small things that do go wrong are a much bigger problem up there than they would be down here.
Yeah, so in lab, a lot can go wrong with experiments, but most usually it's not so very dramatic as it is in fiction typically. And of course, in fiction, you want to take everyday possibilities and then blow them up 100 times or 1,000 times, or in Hollywood, maybe 1,000,000 times. But yeah, some of the things which can go wrong is you can have some sort of spillages of infectious material, for instance, even though today in science very often you have like plenty of safety checks. So for instance, if you're going to be working with like a very infectious virus, so typically like this virus is going to be somehow inactivated, that it cannot so easily infect others, unless of course you need this property in your research. And then also one of the other things that can and often does go wrong is anyone who's doing like genome editing, there is this known problem, which is the so-called off-target effects. And that's basically, if you want to insert like let's say a red color somewhere, and most often you cannot so precisely target this specific spot where you want to insert something, but it's going to get inserted randomly on different positions. So this is a real problem in science today, and there are plenty of people solving this problem in molecular biology and making this method better and better. But typically today you would need to do this in a large number of cells and then only select the ones which have the best possible insertions. And this is also why this is rather, if you look at it, rather inefficient process, and also why human cloning is something that we're most likely not going to see in any near future. It's just simply, it would be unethical to do something like this.
Definitely. All right, let's end on a happy note. And what are your favorite things about your field that you would like more people to know?
Favorite things about my field? I guess it's the international aspect of my field. I love that even though NASA is a product of the United States, it has such far-reaching and international collaboration. We're working on the Orion program with the European Space Agency, and a lot of our engineers are going over there, and a lot of their engineers are coming over here, working directly with each other to get this program going. And I just love that aspect of this field. That is a big part of why I'm in human spaceflight, because it's human spaceflight. It's about the future of our species, and I love seeing spaceflight and this field in sci-fi portrayed as the best of our potential, our ability to work together and overcome borders and become an international species. And so I guess that's my favorite thing about my job is seeing these scientists who work together and how the borders aren't even there when we're doing these things.
One of the things that I really love about my job as an environmental engineer is it kind of puts me on the front lines of environmental protection. Working for the private sector and these big companies in manufacturing, there's a lot of risk there for a lot of pollution to the environment. And having people like me and hiring a lot of people like me to help them manage their factories is kind of puts me on the front lines there, and allows me to have a huge impact on protecting the environment. So it's that sense of purpose that my job gives me that I like the best, that I can help find that balance between our modern world and manufacturing products and materials and automobiles that we need for our life, while also trying to protect and preserve the natural environment.
So I think this is an interesting question. Because maybe I would like to address it not just the favorite part of my field, but maybe one of my favorite parts in science. And I think that's not just specific for my field, that you have a lot of these meetings and conferences where you can kind of meet different people from different countries. You can listen to their talks. You can learn a lot, really a lot, in just a matter of few hours. And that's something that I really, really enjoy. And that's something that you can, relate to also when writing science fiction, because just sitting there and listening to so many interesting talks, sharing your research with others, and also listening to the work that others did inspires you for so many different stories and different scenarios that you can then later on experiment on just through writing. So that's maybe one of my favorite things, but as I said, that's not like specific for my field, it's more like science in general.
That's an excellent answer. Yeah, so we're going to be live answering questions. If you have any questions that you would like our panelists to answer for you, just write them in and we will tackle them, as many of them as we can get through. Thanks for watching.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.